Hey there, fellow Wargamers. Welcome back to the channel. Justin our Painter, and today we're going to be talking about a critical concept of Wargaming strategy, and that is critical mass. I'd like to welcome you guys back to the channel. If you're new here, please alpha strike that like and subscribe button. And if you're a returning viewer, thank you so much for tuning in to continue to help support what I do. That said, let's go ahead and jump into it today, and we're going to be discussing the tabletop wargaming strategy or concept of critical mass. So last time we covered tentpole units, those big powerful forces you build your strategy around, but what happens when you focus too much on those heavy hitters, or the opposite, when you flood the board with weaker units? That's where the idea of critical mass comes in. So what exactly is critical mass in the context of tabletop wargaming specifically and games like Battletech? It's about finding the right balance between quantity and quality, having enough units on the table to control the game, and quality units packing enough firepower to deal with your opponent's forces efficiently. If you don't strike that balance, your strategy can crumble fast. You're going to have a tentpole unit that's relatively easy to take out and makes the rest of your forces kind of crumble because you don't have enough stuff to support them. And if you have too much of a horde of stuff, you might not have enough damage to actually dislodge your opponent's effective forces either. Critical mass is essentially the point where your force has enough models or units to control the board while still maintaining the power to eliminate key enemy threats. Too few units and you'll get outmaneuvered. Too many cheap units and you might lack the punch to take out the big guns. The goal is balance. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about the tentpole units again, just a little bit more. These are those massive game-defining units we all love, whether it's a starved clan assault mechs or a few heavily armored battle mechs in your inner sphere lance. They dominate the battlefield, but here's the issue. Tentpole units are expensive. They spend a ton of points to get them, which means you're going to have fewer units overall on the table. For example, you might field a powerful clan assault star, 5 massive mechs that are the pinnacle of destruction, but even though those 5 models can wipe the floor with most opponents, they can't be everywhere at once. If you lose just 1 or 2 of those mechs, you're going to start struggling to maintain critical mass. With fewer units, you're outnumbered to lose board control very quickly. As a good example of this, when I go to events like Southern Assault, I like to usually start my force building out by trying to bring at least 12 models. If I'm playing Inner Sphere, almost exclusively at least 12 models. If I'm playing clanners, it's a little bit harder. My number typically starts around 10 with some battle armor sprinkled in. I've played against opponents in these tournament settings when it's objective based and not just destruction that will bring a very low model count elite hyper strong force in terms of damage output, but they lack the material to spread out across the table. So with my forces, I have a couple that are pretty strong, but not overly weighed in one direction. I have enough models to achieve critical mass so that if I lose 1 or 2, I can still play the game. So in this particular example, I played with an individual at Southern Assault 2 years ago. They basically had a starved clan mix, super low skill, which in Battletech terms is very good. They packed a huge punch, right? Once I knocked out 1 or 2, this individual could not move those models to control objectives. And even if I was losing 2 to 1, right? So they started with 5, I started with 12. I took out 2 of theirs and I lost 4. Maybe it was some light mechs. I still have 8 to their 3. Now I can sit back, play objectives, use the terrain to my advantage to hide, and force those strong units to come dig me out. And if those units don't move in mass, they're going to be fighting me 1 versus many. And if they do move in mass, they're not on the objectives to win the game. So it often ends up being an attrition-style gameplay. So one of the things that I recommend for people that struggle to achieve critical mass and also enjoy some of their games is the first thing that I say is like, what kind of games are you playing? Because this example of the hyper elite force, that's effectiveness changes depending on what type of games you are playing. And I encourage people to play objective-based games, not just killy, because the killing games really focus only on one style of gameplay, which you could argue that the same may be true for objectives, but the objectives can be a variety of different types of gameplays. Killy is just killy. So if you look at lore terms for Battletech, this is actually a really good concept to drive home for critical mass. If you look at the clanners, when they came in to invade Terra, they went to the Inner Sphere, all of the struggles that they had when they were fighting off Comstar, Inner Sphere forces, whatnot, the clanners had the better pilots, the better tech, the better gear. They had less of it, and then they were unwilling to bid equal forces. So they would come down to fight, and then their opponent's not playing with the same set of rules, so to speak, and they may be like, well, I'm going to have my trinary, let's say 15 battle mechs, and then Comstar shows up and goes, cool, we have 5 companies, or something to that effect. So every loss that the clanners faced hurt really bad, whereas the Inner Sphere had the quantity side of that equation. You can look at this in like World War II terms as well. You can look at the German tech with their tanks, which was like the pinnacle of like badassery in terms of what they could do, armor, shells they were putting out and so forth. There wasn't a lot of them. And then you look at the U.S. when we started flooding into Europe or in Germany and whatnot with all the Sherman tanks. Not as good on paper, but there was a lot of them. So if we lost a couple of Shermans, it ended up being worth it if we took out one of the German tanks, right? So same concept here. You don't want to have stuff that's on paper so bad that you just throw it at your opponent's forces, it crashes on them and can't do anything. But there is something to be said for finding that striking balance between quality and quantity, and then for me, I define that term as critical mass. So to continue driving things home, on the flip side of some of what we were discussing, let's say instead of the clanners, you're playing in a sphere and you decide to field a whole company, like I do, 12 cheap mechs. You've got tons of models on the table, way more than your clan opponent. Early on, you'll have the upper hand in objective control, swarming the board and holding positions. But there might be a problem. If you rely too heavily on weak, low-cost mechs, you might find yourself in trouble during the late game. Sure, you've got the numbers, but if your mechs aren't packing enough firepower, they won't be able to efficiently trade with your opponent. When the big threats come calling, you may not have what it takes to bring them down. And that's why critical mass is so important to wargaming, and probably to some aspects outside of wargaming as well. Too much quantity, you can't hit hard enough. Too much quality, and you won't have enough units to control the board. So how do we strike that balance? I listen to a lot of podcasts on the internet, and in particular, I like listening to like a veteran podcasts because they've done stuff in life I've never had to do. And one of the things that's really been interesting for me listening to those is like a lot of like Navy SEAL Special Forces guys is the tech, the gear that they had. Very hyper-specific, hyper-elite force with hyper-specialized gear, right? In an ideal world, one might think, well, why doesn't every soldier have the same training, the same gear? That brings up logistics and cost as well. But it kind of brings into focus that, like, if you're going into a war type scenario, not every one of your soldiers is going to be a Navy SEAL, a Green Beret, a Delta Force, or whatever. It's not practical. So you have those hyper elite tent pole style units or specialized units, and then you have the large scale fighting force that does all of the other things. And finding that balance between the two is where you might find your critical mass. And that's kind of a real world example of that. Hopefully that makes sense. In my head it does. I'm not sure if I've articulated that well. So we're going to talk about striking a balance between quality and quantity. When I'm building a Battletech Alpha Strike list, I usually aim, as I mentioned before, for somewhere between 12 and 16 units to get that balance of critical mass. I'll invest in one solid tentpole unit, and personal favorite is the Mad Cat W if I'm playing with clan mechs. Now this mech is an absolute beast, especially at short to medium ranges, and its 12 movement makes it super versatile on most Alpha Strike boards, letting me bring its guns to bear on key targets very easily. To support my tentpole unit, I'll usually add 2 other mechs with solid mobility and damage output. They might not quite be tentpole units, but very close. This provides a little bit of redundancy in case my Mad Cat takes a hit. A good rule of thumb here is the saying, 2 is 1, 1 is none, meaning always have a backup plan. In my list, that backup plan involves at least 3 solid mobile damage dealers, one of which is typically the tentpole. With my tentpole and damage dealers sorted, I use my remaining points on cheaper, faster units, one that can function like pawns, harassing my opponent and contesting objectives. These units make my opponent choose to either focus on my Mad Cat and its backup, or deal with my fast units capturing objectives. That kind of tactical pressure is what helps me maintain critical mass and control the board and the game state. As an alternative, if I'm looking for tentpole units for my specific inner sphere units or forces, depending on the area you're playing, you may not have access to some of the nice goody clan tech, right? Some of those tentpole units end up being like high, or maybe not necessarily high damage, but they're more on the tanky side of what would be a tentpole unit. So I'll field a unit that sacrifice some of its damage but has lots of HP pips, which means when that Atlas walks up, if it's a cheap Atlas with average damage but not spiked damage, or Marauder or Warhammer, whatever it is I'm running, I've run all 3 of those, march them up to an objective, your opponent has to determine how many turns is it going to take of me focusing fire on this unit to take it out? Can I take it out effectively? Do I need to be shooting at those other units? So sometimes you end up getting tent poles that aren't necessarily just heavy damage dealers, but they're tanks, and you can walk them up to an objective, and it takes so much material for your opponent to take them out that they're forced to sometimes make painful choices between, do I shoot this or do I shoot that? That's a little bit different than the tent pole units that are almost like glass cannons, like that Mad Cat. It's got much less life than the Atlas I like to run. It makes up for that with its mobility and its damage output, and hoping it doesn't get hit, but if your opponent does hit it, it hurts. Whereas the Atlas, your opponent is almost decidedly going to be able to hit that thing, but it's got so much armor that can usually weather the storm for a few turns. So things to consider when you're building your forces. So from here, it's all about adapting to your opponent's playstyle and making smart tactical decisions on the fly. Remember, like Jean-Luc Picard once said, it is possible to commit no mistakes and still lose. That is not a weakness, that is life. So go into your games with a solid list, do your best, and afterwards always ask yourself, what could I do better next time? Could my list be tweaked? What tactical decisions could I have made better that might have helped me win this game? So let's go ahead and see how critical mass plays out in a Battletech scenario. Imagine you're fielding a balanced inner sphere lance, you've got a warhammer and a hunchback for heavy firepower, supported by a couple of Valkyries for mobility and objective play. Your warhammer is your tent pole, bringing serious firepower. The hunchback acts as a mid-tier brawler, also bringing some damage of his own. Your lighter units, they're there to grab objectives, flank, and screen your heavier mechs from being overwhelmed. In this particular little bit of an example, you've got enough models to maintain control of the board and enough firepower to deal with big threats. That's the essence of critical mass. Units work together to hold the battlefield while dealing damage where it matters, and if you lose a lighter mech, you're still in the fight. Now, obviously, in this case, we're discussing a lance, not a full-on company of mechs, but the same kind of philosophy holds true. Having some tentpole units, having the mid-tier units to support them, and then the light-tier units to be able to go out, harass, get objectives, and when those pawns go down, not that big of a deal. So as a bonus section here, we're going to talk about combined arms approaches for a little bit. As a final tip, don't forget about combined arms and Battletech. Sure, mechs are the star of the show, but tanks and infantry are cheap, durable, and can fill out your army in ways mechs just can't. You can get a lot of mileage out of these units, both the board control and versatility, and they often help shave points when you're tight on a budget and want to make points for your tentpole units or some of your support stuff. Plus, they add a cool visual element to your games. Combined arms is another way to maintain that all-important critical mass, so don't be afraid to experiment with different units and options. You might just find the perfect combination for your playstyle. And right now, with the Kickstarter stuff finally fulfilling, there's no shortage of tanks and combined arms type of things that you can use, your mechanized units, so to speak. And especially once those hit retail, you guys should see a flood of new plastics that you guys will have at your disposal for your games. All right, folks, that is it for today. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've got a better understanding of what critical mass is, or at least what it is to me, and how to strike that balance between quality and quantity in your Battletech and other war games. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. If you have any other tips or tricks on your end that you guys like to employ to help achieve critical mass, types of units you like to field or strategies, sound off in the comments below. Let's get that chat going. As always, though, folks, that's all I've got for you today. Keep painting your models, keep rolling your dice, and I will catch you guys next time. Made it this far, you're probably a viewer that already hits that like button when you see a video come up. You're probably already a subscriber, and you probably jump into the comments down below to help support the channel, to help support that algorithm. But if you're looking for some other ways to help support the channel too, make sure you check the description down below. Maybe you want to pick up some paints from Monument Hobbies. That's my paint of choice. The Pro Acrylic line is chef's kiss, good stuff. Maybe you want to check out some of the offerings from Death Designs, where I work in my day job. We got plenty of 3D printed products, as well as MDF terrain, some of the stuff that I have designed myself and we play with here on the channel. And if you're looking to bolster your Battletech ranks, miniatures, and offerings, make sure you check out Bobby from Fortress Miniatures and Games. He's one of the main supporters of the channel as well, and supporting any of these companies helps support what I do and helps to ensure that I can continue to bring content to all of you. If you want to become a super supporter, I highly recommend you guys check out the Patreon. You guys give that extra little edge to help push more content out, and I really do appreciate that. And my ultimate goal on the channel is to continue to be able to not only put out the content we have now, but to get to a point where you can put out more content later, whether that be battle reports or painting tutorials or just more rambles, anything at all. I'd like to be doing more content for you. This is something that I enjoy. I like being able to cast a light into the darkness to bring a little bit of hobby positivity to all of you and make you feel good, and also enjoy playing games myself. As we do the final sign off here, though, I do want to go ahead and switch on over and do the scroll of awesome to showcase all the Patreon supporters, the super supporters of the channel, to give them some recognition for helping support what I do. Thank you guys so much, and I will catch you guys.